I'm Nicholas Grene. I'm retired professor of English from Trinity, just down the road. It's my great privilege to introduce Margaret Mills Harper, who needs absolutely no introduction. But I'll do it anyway, because that's what I'm here for. She's been a Glucksman Professor of Contemporary Writing in English since 2010. Before that, she was in Georgia State University, where she is still an adjunct professor. That's how much they value her, clearly. She has been director of the Yeats Summer School. She's been president of the International Yeats Society. She's been visiting professor at the University of Lille. Just to pick two of her most recent publications from her vast list of publications. She contributed the chapter on George Yeats to the Oxford Handbook of W.B. Yeats, edited by Matthew Campbell and Lauren Arrington. And she's also contributed to, has already been mentioned today, the Edinburgh Companion to Yeats and the Arts. Two of the editors are here, Tom and Adrian. Been a mammoth great task, I know. And her contribution, which we're really looking forward to, has the intriguing title of Cuchulainn the Cowboy. Cuchulainn with no backseat to his pants. We've heard about Cuchulainn the Cowboy has got to have had a back to his pants. Meg Harper did not start as a Yeatsian, you may be surprised to learn. Her first book, The Aristocracy of Art, James Joyce and Tom Wolfe, was about the autobiographical projects of those two apparently quite dissimilar writers. But she was drawn into, if we can call it the Yeats industry, it's really very disrespectful to call it that, by her parents, who were, of course, pioneers of the scholarship of Yeats's occult writings, magical writings, and she's described how even from her childhood, she had this background of people doing gyres, et cetera, and needless to say, sooner or later, she was drawn into the team, so she became one of the editors of the third and fourth volume of the Yeats Vision Papers, and since then has edited, with a collaborator, Catherine Paul, the volume of the 1937 Vision, a task that none of us really envy her, I think. I think we owe a great deal, all of us who care about Yeats, and that's everybody in the room here, owe a huge debt to Meg Harper, not only because she has put in the work, the painstaking, laborious work of editing the 1937 Vision, of all that work on the Vision Papers, but I think there's more to it than that. Yeatsians, I really shouldn't say generally, I'll talk about, Yeatsians have a degree of discomfort with a vision and the automatic writing. I will speak for myself. When I was writing a book about the language of Yeats's poetry, what I really wanted to call it was Yeats without gyres. Because I was so scared of getting involved with all that stuff. And in her book, The Wisdom of Two, Meg Harper takes on directly that issue of belief and faith. Did he really believe in it? Can we believe in it? Can you make students believe in it? And she produces, I think, an extraordinarily elegant and sophisticated answer to that set of questions. Answers that are really, I think, intellectually compelling. It's a great book, I'm sure all of you know it, partly for highlighting the role of George Yeats in that collaboration on the automatic writing, a part that has been very often, as it were, occluded partly George Yeats's own doing. She wanted, as it were, to suppress her part in it, but that book shows luminously how collaborative the whole process was from start to finish. She has marvelous close readings of the text, so that it doesn't any longer, the vision doesn't any longer become, oh my God, I have to try to understand this. It becomes another literary text, which is brilliantly interpreted by Meg's analysis. She shows us the different parts played by the controls through the automatic writing as a whole, how much these texts are polyphonic, if I may call it that. And by the end of the Wisdom of Two, you don't any longer, at least I don't any longer, feel that it's just this forbidding area in Yeats studies. I suppose I have to go there. I have to read A Vision again. What am I going to do? It becomes something that you can engage with as central to Yeats's work, as we all know it was. It's my great pleasure to introduce Margaret Mills Harper.
Wow. Well, I should be so acknowledged. Thank you very much for that beautiful, stunning tribute to somebody I don't really know, but I'd like to. So I was actually, my eye was caught by one of the quotations from Padraig Colum in Tom's brilliant paper earlier, where he was talking about Yeats's contemporary movement back into folklore in a kind of new way, having had the austere poetry that we Irish or we contemporary poets will emulate. Which that quotation might resonate with some of the things I'm going to say. We could see if it's true. So anyway, first, thank you very much for being here. And also thanks to Julian, and thanks to Chris, and thanks to Pauline for the work you've done. And thank you also to the Institute and the university for inviting me here. So this lecture started when I was thinking about a remark that was made a number of years ago by Helen Vendler. Vendler said that Yeats had several national and international identities. This is a very serious overgeneralization, but I've always liked it. Yeats's career can be labeled as beginning by being an English poet, meaning that his formal structures and his subject matter fit his work into the poetic milieu of the latter part of the 19th century in England. Then he became an Irish poet by, of course, devoting himself to Irish cultural and political independence. And then after the War of Independence, that project shifted, and the Nobel Prize that we're celebrating welcomed the new nation into the community of nations, as well as acknowledging Ireland's most celebrated man of letters on the global stage as a world poet. In the 1920s, as we know, Yeats was increasingly critical of the socially conservative government of the Free State, the power ceded to the church, and narrow-minded morality was offensive to him. He was also immersed in a massive occult project that resulted in the first version of A Vision in 1926. Starting then, literally almost as soon as the book appeared, he dove into a deep course of study and tried to get ready to revise the book, which took him a long time. In the late 1920s and into the 1930s, in addition to everything else that we've been hearing that he was doing, he was reading everything from ancient Greek philosophy to Babylonian astrology to Byzantine art to Hindu belief and ritual to Japanese religious drama to Zen Buddhism. He was reading contemporary anthropology, European history, contemporary philosophy, and Italian fascist political theory. It must be said he was not reading the last of those very well. Of course, he was an Irish writer in the midst of all of this, and despite also living much of his later life in places outside Ireland. But his Irishness changes. It does change, I think. And so how does it change? That's the question that I'm interested in right now. And what I'm going to do to illustrate one little change is look at two well-known poems. One of them is from the 1890s, and the other one is from the 1920s. I want to draw your attention to one significant place. Now, I know you've been drinking wine, but you've got a job to do. There's something I want you to do. Pay attention to place names, okay? And what I'm going to suggest is that in the late period, there's a change in how place is perceived, and that this kind of perception indicates a larger shift. What seemed right or appropriate in terms of being Irish doesn't apply any longer. In the title, I used a word, dissensual. That word is a nod to the French philosopher Jacques Rancière. So we have another French moment, I suppose, here. Rancière's notion of dissensus stresses not disagreement, but a perceptual quality that requires an othering of the whole conversation. So that political disagreement sometimes cannot possibly result in a common sense. There is no common sense. So the issue is not so much argument, one side versus another side, as perception. One side and the other side cannot perceive the terms of the argument. And so there's a kind of a radical refusal in Rancière's thinking. And this underlies some of the kinds of thinking that have been done recently in indigenous studies, which I've been interested in, and that's a completely different story. Indigenous relationships to liberal democratic politics or the arts. And I think that kind of frame can help us to see some of the difficulties of Yeats's late work, which is international, but also deeply local. And so in using Rancière, which is a really weird thing to do in a way, I don't want to be guilty of cultural appropriation. Rancière was a liberation, interested in liberation, and here we are in this place, and political liberation of those who are left outside the room with their hiking boots is not really on the agenda. So I hope I'm not going to be appropriative, but and Yeats commands all kinds of authority, of course, in the years following the Nobel Prize. So in some ways, it seems really a bad idea to do what I'm going to do. So I hope you'll forgive me, and I hope it works. So here we go. The first part, this is part one, Red Hanrahan's Song About Ireland. So this is a very popular poem. Suddenly I've gotten louder. Is that okay? It appeared in a number of forms over many years, as you may know. It was first published in 1894 in a magazine, then reprinted 3 years later without a title, embedded in a story called Kathleen, the Daughter of Houlihan and Hanrahan the Red, in a lovely book called The Secret Rose. Hanrahan the Red, as you probably know, is a peasant wanderer, a figure. He's a committed womanizer, a teller of tales, and he's a semi-authorial mouthpiece. So the poem, Red Hanrahan's Song About Ireland, was slightly revised and included in the collection called In the Seven Woods. And here's In the Seven Woods. This book was the first book published by Dun Emer Press, which was the small artisanal enterprise that Yeats's sisters ran, particularly his sister Elizabeth. As was Yeats's usual practice, the book then reappeared in a cheaper and more accessible edition soon afterwards by the big trade publisher Macmillan. In the Seven Woods is a short book of poetry because its author was at this time doing a lot of other things besides writing poetry. Among other things, he was co-founding a theater. He had also sustained a deep emotional blow when Maud Gonne, the woman with whom he was, of course, in love, married somebody else. But at any rate, here's the poem. The old brown thorn trees break in two, high over Cummin Strand, under a bitter black wind that blows from the left hand. Our courage breaks like an old tree in a black wind and dies, but we have hidden in our hearts the flame out of the eyes of Kathleen, the daughter of Houlihan. The wind has bundled up the clouds high over Knocknarea and thrown the thunder on the stones for all that Maeve can say. Angers that are like noisy clouds have set our hearts abeat, but we have all bent low and kissed the quiet feet of Kathleen, the daughter of Houlihan. The yellow pool has overflowed high up on Clooth na Bare, for the wet winds are blowing out of the clinging air. Like heavy flooded waters, our bodies and our blood, but purer than a tall candle before the holy rood is Kathleen, the daughter of Houlihan. Okay, this poem certainly has Maud Gonne as inspiration. Kathleen Houlihan, as you know, is a political representation of Ireland, allegorical representation. It has ancient roots, this figure does, in the Cailleach, or the old woman, an indigenous Irish personification of the generative power of the landscape. The world was the Cailleach's grave and also the site of her rebirth. Later, with the arrival of the Celts, a male pantheon was layered over the older cosmology, and then the role became doubled. She was then not only the goddess, but also the woman mated to the male leader. And as such, she became a young woman as well as an old woman. And in this form, she survived well into the literate era as an object of male desire and patriotic devotion. She has direct roots in an Irish poetic language form called the Ashling. I'm probably telling you things that everybody knows here. And this poem has roots in that tradition too. In 1902, Yeats and Lady Gregory co-wrote the play Kathleen and Houlihan, which caused a sensation when it was presented, of course, at the opening night of the Abbey. There's the opening night poster. And part of the disturbance, as you know, was caused by Maud Gonne playing the title role. Maud, who had an unerring sense of self-performance, made sure that she was seen as young queen as well as hag in an iconic moment in Irish theater history. She also loved this poem. Over the ensuing decades, this poem reappeared in various collections, and in 1927, 33 years after its first appearance, it was republished in a handsome compilation of the stories of Red Hanrahan and the Secret Rose. And here's the title page for that collection. As you can easily see from the strikingly modernist design, the very different cultural and political climate of the 1920s gives new meanings to the same story in the same collection of stories. And this is Nora McGuinness's artwork. Another feature of this poem, by the way, of this book, is that it starts with a recently composed poem, which is dedicated to Nora McGuinness in the opening pages. And the poem is Sailing to Byzantium. So suddenly that old story is in a new frame, and if you were the reader of this new volume, you would read Sailing to Byzantium and then move on to it. Sailing to Byzantium introduces a book later, the next year, The Tower, which we all know. And The Tower is full of some of his most challenging and, to use a word he used, bitter verse. Themes like old age and war, including civil war, are included. Most unsettling in this volume is the suggestion in several poems that human beings love violence with a passion that is essentially erotic, and that the history of our species is littered with ritualized evidence of the darkness that follows every moment of light. So there's poem number one. And there's Sailing to Byzantium, which you know. You don't need a slide on Sailing to Byzantium. Okay. Part two, The Tower. The second poem in the book, The Tower, is the title poem. It's also the second poem that I want to look at right now. It's, as you know, a three-part meditation on aging and death that is set in Tourbalili, the ancient tower house that Yeats and his wife George renovated to live in. A project that was more successful symbolically than practically, it must be said. The tower was a military installation, not built to be comfortable. It also floods regularly. You can talk to Adrian about the flooding. So the first part of the poem, The Tower, presents the emotional and intellectual problem of old age. In the second section, the speaker sends imagination forth to summon figures from local stories and the history of the building. And in the third part, the speaker writes his poetic will, announces his faith in human imagination, and prepares for the dissolution of death. The poem is situated firmly in the building depicted in the cover design, in which, of course, the tower is represented twice, the reflection of the building in the water of the stream below the building, or the representation of the building itself. So the cover of the book announces that the relationship between place and imagination is going to be a central one in this book. So even before you open the book, you know that you can guess that this may be true. Now, I have to admit, interested as I am in the philosophical stuff, most of the time that I've been reading The Tower, I've been focusing on parts 1 and parts 3, and skipping all the stories in the middle. But recently I've found myself spending time on part 2. So that's what I'm going to do today, is spend time on part 3, not the battered kettle of the first part, and not the dying swan of the third part. So I'm going to read the first few stanzas. And don't forget your homework. Right? You got your homework, okay. So here we go. I pace upon the battlements and stare on the foundations of a house, or where tree, like a sooty finger, starts from the earth, and send imagination forth under the day's declining beam, and call images and memories from ruin or from ancient trees, for I would ask a question of them all. Beyond that ridge lived Mrs. French, and once, when every silver candlestick or sconce lit up the dark mahogany and the wine, a serving man that could divine that most respected lady's every wish ran and with the garden shears clipped an insolent farmer's ears and brought them in a little covered dish. Some few remembered still when I was young a peasant girl commended by a song who'd lived somewhere upon that rocky place and praised the color of her face and had the greater joy in praising her, remembering that, if walked she there, farmers jostled at the fair, so great a glory did the song confer. And certain men, being maddened by those rhymes, or else by toasting her a score of times, rose from the table and declared it right to test their fancy by their sight. But they mistook the brightness of the moon for the prosaic light of day. Music had driven their wits astray, and one was drowned in the great bog of Clun. And then there's a few more stanzas. A brief history of the people associated with the place and the tower. And then it ends with Red Hanrahan, a person that Yeats himself invented. And then the poet dismisses him. Old lecher, with a love on every wind, bring up out of that deep considering mind all that you have discovered in the grave. For it is certain that you have reckoned up every unforeknown, unseeing plunge, lured by a softening eye, or by a touch, or a sigh, into the labyrinth of another's being. Does the imagination dwell the most upon a woman won or woman lost? If on the lost, admit you turned aside from a great labyrinth, out of pride, cowardice, some silly oversubtle thought, or anything called conscience once, and that if memory recur, the sun's under eclipse and the day blotted out. So, after part one of the poem, which presents the problem of the speaker's old age, part two seems to shift to an entirely different topic, the stories and the history associated with the tower. And most troubling, the speaker wants to work out whether the imagination desires loss more than life. And in the form of a question to Hanrahan, whose amorous failures stimulate his creative power as a storyteller, the poet, of course, wonders about himself. The you in that last stanza, admit you turned aside, has clearly expanded to include Yeats, the old man in the tower, as well as his created character, Hanrahan. And specifically, the question in the first couplet of that last stanza, does the imagination dwell the most upon a woman won or woman lost, asks us about asks the reader about the attraction of remorse. Remorse interests me. It's an emotional state that features violence against the self. It's from the Latin word mordere, which means to bite or wound by gnawing or chewing. So you chew on yourself if you are remorseful. The psyche bites itself in the form of self-accusation. Hanrahan has mighty memories, we're told, but their might is connected to self-condemnation. The sun is put under eclipse, and day itself erased by the power of this grief-stricken self-absorption. The blotting out of the sun and the day then lead to the passage in the third part of the poem that's the poet's credo in these ringing trimeter lines. Death and life were not till man made up the whole, made lock, stock, and barrel out of his bitter soul. I, sun and moon and star all. Sorry, I forgot to change the slide again. And further add to that being dead, we rise, dream, and so create translunar paradise. I really love this. We get to make heaven up, we get to invent the whole thing. All right, so there you go, the tower. And now I'm going to focus on place names. All right, that first poem, Red Hanrahan's Song About Ireland, contains 3 striking Irish-sounding place names for people like me who are not native speakers of Irish. Cumminstrand, and of course Yeats wasn't either, Knocknarea, and Cluth-na-Bar. These are all real places around Sligo. The first is a wide expanse of tidal flats. The second is an iconic mountain overlooking the town and the sea. And the third is an open megalithic tomb near the top of a nearby peak. These place names have several things in common. Let's see, sorry. A first thing that they have in common is that they sound great. They sound very musical, and they fit beautifully with the 14ers that are the metrical pattern of the poem, with their stressed first and third syllables. Common strand, knock na ray, cluth na bear. It's really cameen strand, but that doesn't fit into the rhythm nearly as well. Second, they're associated with powerful women in Irish mythology. Cameen strand is not itself mythic, but the strand itself in the poem, let's see if I can get the poem back. I couldn't go backwards. Now I'm going to go forwards again, I think. Sorry, we're having a technical moment here. Enjoy the slideshow. I have a lot of slides, don't I? There we go. All right. Common strand lends its name to the real item of interest in the landscape, which is the old brown thorn trees. And these are black thorn trees, which are strongly associated with winter and the fairy people, especially the Cailleach, or the divine crone. Knock na ray is linked with Queen Maeve, the warrior queen of the West in the Ulster cycle. Maeve is also associated with the old sovereignty goddess. And Cluth na Bear, in its very name, evokes the Cailleach goddess. Okay. The tower. The second part of the tower is emphatically set in and about a place. But there's only one place name, right? The Great Bog of Clun. The setting is clear and definite, as if the poet were standing right next to us, pointing his finger at real locations, right? Over there, that ridge, that rocky place, the neighboring cottages, this house, these rocks, this door. None of these have names because they don't need names. They're right there. You can see them. The bog itself, the Great Bog of Clun, is a real thing. It's a very boggy townland, which is next to Ballylee, and would be a very easy walk from there if the ground weren't so wet. The name means meadow in Irish, which is not what a bog is. But it's a really common name. There are, I found 16 townlands named Clun in Ireland. And it has no mythological significance at all. So, very small items, and I'm going to try to make them mean something. In the 20s and the 30s, Ireland had a state that was formed after the Civil War and a political stasis after the partition of the island. And in this very contested place, Yeats seems to insist on flouting even the terms of the debate, the political debate. His politics and his art in the 30s, which are very problematic, might be described as consistently dissensual. So, for example, now that the ascendancy is no longer relevant in contemporary politics, late Yeats responds to arguments about the new state by bypassing Irishness entirely and talking a lot about being Anglo-Irish or Anglo-Irishness. Rather than positioning himself on one side or other of the Irish or not Irish, he starts claiming that he's Protestant, which he's never really done before. Rather than positioning himself as either a modern and secular, modernist figure or a religious, traditionally religious or not traditionally religious person, or a traditionally religious person, he makes himself an outlandishly heretical person. He uses figures like Reeve, the hermit in supernatural songs, or Crazy Jane, to sing of things like sexual impurity as holiness. He celebrates iconoclastic individuals while making exaggerated claims for hierarchic rule. His position is still as an outsider, position he really liked, always, from the center of power. But now the power is emanating from the Irish state more often than the English hegemony. His late work is marked by an overt emphasis on timeless philosophy, but also on the time-bound and deteriorating human body. Irish figures in the late poems and plays are less likely to be heroes or martyrs, more likely to be old men or women, saints, fools, even ghosts. Strikingly generous cultural attitudes alternate with statements, especially in the early 30s, that strike popular, even fascist notes. As Dan mentioned, the fascism needs not to be looked past. Poems that celebrate yogic or Zen-like attachments share space with poems that are marching songs, political marching songs. One poem will adopt one position, and then the next poem will adopt an opposite position. And this results in a kind of dizzying effect for a reader of these late poems, I think. One seeming resolution is dismantled by the one on the next page. A number of poems used a weighty and pensive form from the Italian Renaissance, ottava rima. Others used short, jaggedy lines that sound like folk ballads. Some are very short poems, printed in series. Still others are ballads meant to be printed up as such, as if to be passed from hand to hand after some public event. In general, I find this poetry both absorbing and also very difficult to come to terms with. It's as if the contrast were dialed up on an image. The softness and the nuance of grayed tones just dialed up into stark black and white. The drama also shifts. Many earlier plays feature Irish historical or mythological settings, like Kathleen Houlihan, of course, or On Balder's Strand. Later plays, even if they're set in the west of Ireland, and many are, like Purgatory or The Death of Cuchulainn, are likely to be disorienting in terms of place. It's profoundly unclear where exactly the place is, or even if the characters are in this world. In Purgatory, are the characters on the stage in Purgatory, or is the audience in Purgatory? Who are we? Where are we? Later drama also blends genres, so it's difficult to characterize a play as a tragedy or a farce, for example. Alexandre Poulain has noted that Yeats's drama pushes towards a theatrical form that might take us beyond the realm of the possible and the intelligible. And this reminds me of the brilliant theater panel this morning. We were talking, and when we were hearing about Yeats's drama, Yeats pushing actors beyond what they could do, but also the drama pushing beyond what it's possible to succeed with doing. I don't think Yeats was aiming for the same goals in the 30s that he had throughout his long career. In the last period of his life, post-Nobel, I think Yeats's aesthetics have changed, along with his drive to create Irishness as something symbolically or ideologically comprehensible. As Yeats knew, and this is where I'm going to get into the dissensus a little bit, his early goal of proving that Irish culture was as noble as any other world culture meant that he and others were adapting native Irish subject matter into a poetic and a dramatic tradition that is essentially English. Such an adaptation is never going to attain more than a second-hand power, and it in fact disempowers its authors and its consumers, to use a capitalist term. The reader is plagued by the difficulty that Rancière identifies when he talks about the difficulty with so-called emancipation. The trouble with a person of authority and power liberating an other is that the recipient of the liberation is, at best, merely released into an existing order, but without the power of the emancipator. So so-called emancipation quite often perpetuates inequality. I think that Yeats might have become dissatisfied with what an indigenous thinker calls the extraction model of cultural inclusion. This is in an American context, North American indigenous folks. Extraction meaning also the extraction of minerals and resources from the ground. Now my next quote is from an ethnomusicologist, but this is not about poetry at all, but I want you to imagine that it's about poetry. This is from an ethnomusicologist who is himself Shtodo, and this is what he says happens when you take indigenous music and put it onto a stage in a concert hall. Listening is oriented toward recognition, whether that be the recognition of formal structures, generic features, or particular musical representations and characterization. This listening for something that you recognize satiates through familiarity, but also through certainty, to feel pleasure from finding the fit of content within a predetermined framework. You take the new stuff and you put it into the old mold. So if you replace the words listening and musical with reading and literary in that quotation, I hope you can see why I find this concept intriguing. Yeats never relinquished his utter commitment to traditional verse form, including the sonnet, the ballad, ottava rima, or even the Dantean terza rima. Yeats was, of course, not an indigenous person, a term that's probably not relevant to Irish people or culture in any case. As we know, he couldn't speak Irish. He wasn't a member of either the peasant or the aristocratic class, the two ends of the social spectrum that he felt had the most claim to Irish identity. He was also a man of the page and the stage, even though his drama is, of course, more experimental in many ways than his poetry. Like many cultural nationalists, though, he had engaged for many years in trying essentially to make folk culture palatable to elite readers and audiences. He seems to have recognized around the time of the bloody conflicts between 1916 and 23 that appropriation of Irish place names and Irish subjects was just that, appropriative. The word implies ownership. It's related to the word propriety. Land ownership and landlordism are intrinsically connected to violence, although Yeats recognized that that very violence also makes beauty or art, as it is conceived in Western culture, makes that beauty or art possible. The mitigation of culture and ceremony remain, but as rituals that serve a function beyond pure art. At any rate, the innovations of the late verse are emphatically local in replacing place names that are essentially window dressing, a kind of homegrown exoticism, Cummin Strand, Cluthnabare. I mean, these are not places where his British readers would have been able to associate themselves at all. Or even a lot of Dublin readers, and certainly not New Yorkers. So in replacing these place names, Yeats also paradoxically places himself and his readers at a cognitive dissonance from the places that he's speaking about. He ceases to be the proprietor of Ireland and Irishness. Rather than owning places, he points to them or describes the experience of being a physical body in them. Rather than aiming to lift up Irishness, he often pulls it down into what he calls the foul rag and bone shop of the heart, for example. As Crazy Jane claims in Crazy Jane Talks with the Bishop, nothing can be soul or whole that has not been rent. Inhabiting space is unsafe. Just inhabiting it, not owning it. It's vulnerable. It's unprotected. Grave or bed, not mansion. In another poem, Crazy Jane shelters under a tree and speaks of her body as a road that men pass over. So I'm going to end with that word rent. I imagine that bloodshed and partition highlighted the dangers to Yeats of fixed claims to national identity. Even though he owned a dwelling place at last, he finally owned himself a house or a castle. Ownership fails as an adequate metaphor for the relationship between people and land. This principle is neatly intimated by the double entendre of that word rent, meaning torn, but also meaning paying for a place that's occupied but not owned. Yeats himself was more a renter than an owner. He was a mover through space rather than a possessor of it. He didn't own a house until 1923, remember. In being so unsettled, even though very unlike them, he was like the millions of Irish women and men for whom migration and exile have been and are part of their history and psyche. And so that's my last suggestion, that Yeats was kept in a continual state of desire for a home rather than safety and comfort in one. That contributed to his agility of mind. As a writer, he's less burdened than many others are by what Dylan Robinson, the indigenous theorist, calls, I love this word, proprioception, meaning the state of hearing and seeing only what is owned or controlled. In any number of late poems and plays, Yeats and his characters refuse the shelter of knowing for the wild weather in the open. And I think that may be one reason why he remains relevant right at this moment when so many people are being forced from homes and homelands. So that's the end of my thing.
Questions?
Oh, sure, yeah.
Yeah.
Did I take too much time?
Yeah. No, you didn't at all. Right. I think this is such a radically new version of Yeats. I'm just trying to assimilate it, so I don't have questions, but I'm hoping people out there. I will make one observation. I think you're a little kind to him about Clúna Bear. I think he just invents it as a mountain. It's not a mountain at all.
No, it is. Actually, I looked it up.
Well,
there's a mountain next to it.
There is, yeah, but he's actually...
It's not the mountain.
He's making an old woman into a mountain, actually, at that point. But it actually reinforces the point that you're making, which is he's using those place names as exoticisms that fit into a particular scansion, and that's what they're doing there.
That's exactly right,
You know,
Just like the Hawk's Rock becomes the Hawk's Well.
Right, yeah. Questions? Yes, Eve?
Thank you so much, Meg. Just a wonderful talk. My question is, I suppose, a more prosaic take on the later Yeats becoming dispossessed and disoriented as you read him. During the break, Tom and I were talking not just about Yeats being quoted, but also how much he was parodied. As soon as his work appeared, it was parodied. And one of the reasons he was parodied was because of his inability to manage Irish place names. I'm thinking of 1924 and Brian O'Higgins' parody of Innisfree, which was all about Yeats and his inability to manage and to master Irish place names in Irish, and his anglicised translation or transliteration of them, and the clumsiness of that, and the ersatz map of Ireland that he produced. Now, I'm not taking that line, but I'm just wondering how much that kind of criticism that Yeats was certainly aware of might have pushed him a little bit along the line of turning away from the detailed mapping through place names that you've described in the earlier material. So is that a factor in not so much the dissensus, but in the kind of dispossession that you're looking at, that it was a forced dispossession because he did not know Irish, and that was a much bigger anxiety perhaps in his later writing than critics have acknowledged?
That's possible. My sense of Yeats responding to criticism is that he quite often doubles down, because he just loves to hate his critics, then quietly admitting that they are correct. But there's certainly maybe something to that. It's also true that poetry was changing. As Tom was talking about, that poetics were changing, and the moment for cultural nationalism had changed. That the movement from The Secret Rose to the modernist drawings of Nora McGuinness is a sign of that kind of thing. You have the same mythological figures, but they appear very differently. They appear in a less frilly context, and what's attractive about them is the structure, the structural integrity of the drawing, not the rose itself as a kind of symbol to draw you in. His verse also, of course, changes and becomes a lot less hypnotic. The early prosody, as we heard this morning, is very spell-like, and you couldn't do that in the late 20s and 30s and get away with it very well. Yeah.
I was fascinated by that, and I wondered, and I think this is perhaps a translator's perspective, the fact that he's not using place names anymore could be because he's anchored in the place. And when he's using this and that, well, you say this and that from a particular stance.
Yeah.
And you're standing there, so you don't need the place names.
Yeah.
Because you're anchored in the space, and this and that are deictics, they're pointers.
Right.
This is close to me, that is farther away. So it's not, I suppose it's reinforcing your theory in a sense, that the place names in later times became irrelevant.
Yeah, no, I think you're exactly right. That reminds me also of the point made this morning about staging his plays outside. You don't have to point to the symbolic resonance of the place because you're in the place. No, I think you're right. He is ironically more situated there, even though he's standing on the top of the tower, looking down at it. He's not as far above it as he is in the early. Emotionally, he's more anxious. Yeah.
Meg, thank you so much. I mean, that was wonderful. It really, I think you really capture late Yeats's poetry through a couple of those examples. Excuse me. And it got me thinking, especially the word rent there. and the idea that it must first be broken before it can be rebuilt, right? This is his late poetry. This is lapis lazuli, the whole sort of circle of destruction and rebirth. And it seems to be really encapsulated in just the cover of the book, as you point out, because one of the things it is, it's literally his tower, but it's also, of course, the tower card from the tarot. And the whole reading of that card is that something must be rent by lightning, destruction must happen, and then something new can fill that place.
Right.
And just a sort of fun note on that, if you look at his cards in the library here, they're all one-faced cards. In other words, if you flip over a king, he's only got one head. He's not got two sides to him like we see on the book, except for the tower card, which he replaced with a double-sided tower card. So we have that exact image in his preferred deck of cards. Cool. So clearly, when he says the tower is my symbol, he means the tower. He also means that card, and he means that very thing that you're pointing out, this cycle of what is being rent and then rebuilt.
Yeah, yeah. I'm reminded of the bookmark that is George's bookmark, isn't it? That's the tower. The tarot tower, it has a bolt of lightning hitting it, and it is falling apart.
Yeah, and if you look on the book, the bottom half that's reflected in the water, those ripples in the water could also look like smoke, right? Like it seems to have those resonances there as well.
Also the floods.
Yeah.
Are there other questions? Yes, Sarah Jane.
It's not a question, it's just, I could listen to you read that poetry. It's like, I didn't feel like it was Yeats. It just felt so like music, but not music either. Like, I can't even put my finger on it, but very embodied.
Oh, thank you.
So I could literally, that would be amazing to walk along anywhere and just listen to that in your ear. That's all I want.
We were talking this morning about wanting students to just read the poems out loud. I always ask my students to memorize, and they hate me. And then they love me later. They always come back and say, I now have that poem, and it's in my body, The older I get as a teacher, the more I just really want them to experience those words,
The phrase "passionate syntax" comes to mind. We're going to have dinner soon. That's very exciting. I was just so struck listening to Meg's talk all the way through when Tom was talking about later Yeats and the way in which that was used, through that period, which I suppose now, at this stage, we would think of as middle Yeats, and I think that what keeps us so excited about reading Yeats and rereading Yeats, as Meg has done so brilliantly this evening, is his capacity to go on changing, to go on developing. Tom said there are multiple Yeatses, and they'll do very well. I think that what we've been faced with is a real new way of looking at late Yeats, and seeing that in the context of a different sort of trajectory, in which there is a middle Yeats, what Colum and so on were thinking of as the later Yeats, what Yeats himself called later poems. And I think that it's this sense that it shifts all the time, and that he shifts and develops all the time. And that's what makes him the very great poet that we're celebrating today. Thank you very much indeed, Meg.
Thank you.